Oh, there you are. Well, the guest weapon today is Granddad's SIG. And I'm going to show you guys how to clear a weapon. And so, this is the P320 X5 Legion. First, you have it pointed in a safe direction, and then you take the cartridge out and then check the chamber to make sure that it's empty. So now it's time to see what happens. What do you mean by it? Said the great goblin, turning to Thorin. Up to no good, I'll warrant. Spying on the private business of my people, I guess. Thieves, I shouldn't be surprised to learn. Murderers and friends of elves. Not unlikely. Come, what have you got to say? Thorin the dwarf at your service, he replied. It was merely a polite nothing. Of the things which you suspect and imagine, we had no idea at all. We sheltered from a storm in what seemed a convenient cave and unused. Nothing was further from our thoughts than inconveniencing goblins in any way whatever. That was true enough. Said the great goblin, so you say. Might I ask what you were doing up in the mountains at all, and where you were coming from, and where you were going to? In fact, I should like to know all about you. Not that it will do you much good, Thorin Oakenshield. I know too much about your folk already, but let's have the truth, or I will prepare something particularly uncomfortable for you. We were on a journey to visit our relatives, our nephews and nieces, and first and second and third cousins, and the other descendants of our grandfathers who live on the east side of these truly hospitable mountains, said Thorin, not quite knowing what to say all at once in a moment, when obviously the exact truth would not do it all. He is a liar, O truly tremendous one, said one of the drivers. Several of our people were struck by lightning in the cave when we invited these creatures to come below, and they are dead as stones. Also, he has not explained this. He held up the sword which Thorin had worn, the sword which had come from the troll's lair. The great goblin gave a truly awful howl of rage when he looked at it, and all his soldiers gnashed their teeth, clashed their shields, and stamped. They knew the sword at once. It had killed hundreds of goblins in its time, when the fair elves of Gondolin hunted them in the hills, or did battle before their walls. They called it Orccrist, Goblin Cleaver, but the goblins called it simply Biter. They hated it and hated worse anyone that carried it. Murderers and elf friends, the great goblin shouted. Slash them, beat them, bite them, gnash them, take them away to dark holes full of snakes, and never let them see the light again. He was in such a rage that he jumped off his seat and himself rushed at Thorin with his mouth open. Just at that moment, all the lights in the cavern went out, and the great fire went off, poof, into a tower of blue glowing smoke right up to the roof that scattered piercing white sparks among all the goblins. The yells and yammering, croaking and gibbering and jabbering, howls and growls and curses, shrieking and shrieking that followed were beyond description. Several hundred wildcats and wolves being roasted slowly alive together would not have compared with it. The sparks were burning holes in the goblins, and the smoke that now fell from the roof made the air too thick for even their eyes to see through. Soon they were falling over one another and rolling in heaps on the floor, biting and kicking and fighting as if they had all gone mad. Suddenly, a sword flashed in its own light. Bilbo saw it go right through the great goblin as he stood dumbfounded in the middle of his rage. He fell dead, and goblin soldiers fled before the sword, shrieking into the darkness. The sword went back into its sheath. Follow me quick, said a voice, fierce and quiet. Before Bilbo understood what had happened, he was trotting along again as fast as he could trot. At the end of the line, down more dark passages with the yells of Goblin Hall growing fainter behind him. A pale light was leading them on. Quicker, quicker, said the voice. The torches will soon be relit. Half a minute, said Dory. who was at the back next to Bilbo and a decent fellow. He made the hobbit scramble on his shoulders as best he could with his tied hands, and then off they went at a run, with a clink clank of chains and many a stumble, since they had no hands to steady themselves with. Not for a long while did they stop, and by that time they must have gone right down to the very mountain's heart. Then Gandalf lit up his wand. Of course it was Gandalf. But just then they were too busy to ask how he got there. He took out his sword again, and it flashed in the dark by itself. It burned with a rage that made it gleam if goblins were about, and now it was bright as a blue flame for delight in killing the great lord of the cave. It made no trouble whatever of cutting through the goblin chains and setting all the prisoners free as quickly as possible. The sword's name was Glamdring, the foe hammer, if you remember. The goblins called it beater and hated it worse than biter if possible. Orc Chris too had been saved, for Gandalf had brought it along as well, snatching it from one of the terrified guards. Gandalf thought of most things, and though he could not do everything, he could do a great deal for friends in a tight corner. "Ah, are we all here?" said he, handing his sword back to Thorin with a bow. "Let me see, that's Thorin. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Where are Fili and Kili? Here they are, 12 and 13, and here's Mr. Baggins, 14. Well, it might be worse, and then again, it might be a good deal better. No ponies and no food, and no knowing quite where we are, and hordes of angry goblins just behind. On we go!" And on they went. Gandalf was quite right. They began to hear goblin noises and horrible cries far behind in the passages they had come through. That sent them on faster than ever, and as poor Bilbo could not possibly go as half as fast, for dwarves can roll along at a tremendous pace, I can tell you, when they have to, they took it in turn to carry him on their backs. Still, goblins go faster than dwarves, and these goblins knew the way better. They had made the paths themselves, and they were madly angry. So, that do what they could, the dwarves heard the cries and howls getting closer and closer. Soon they could even hear the flap of the goblin feet. Many with feet seemed only just round the last corner. The blink of red torches could be seen behind them in the tunnel they were following, and they were getting deadly tired. "Why, oh why did I ever leave my hobbit hole?" said poor Mr. Baggins, bumping up and down on Bomber's back. "Why, oh why did I ever bring a wretched little hobbit on a treasure hunt?" said poor Bomber, who was fat and staggered along with sweat dripping down his nose in his heat and terror. At this point, Gandalf fell behind, and Thorin with him. They turned around a sharp corner. "About turn," he shouted. "Draw your sword, Thorin." There was nothing else to be done, and the goblins did not like it. They came scurrying round the corner in full cry and found Goblin Cleaver and Foe Hammer shining cold and bright, right in their astonished eyes. The ones in front dropped their torches and gave one yell before they were killed. The ones behind yelled still more and leaped back, knocking over those that were running after them. "Biter and beater!" they shrieked, and soon they were all in confusion. Most of them were hustling back the way they had come. It was quite a long while before any of them dared to turn that corner. By that time, the dwarves had gone on again a long, long way on into the dark tunnels of the goblins' realm. When the goblins discovered that, they put out their torches and they slipped on soft shoes, and they chose out their very quickest runners with the sharpest eyes and ears. These ran forward as swift as weasels in the dark, and with hardly any more noise than bats. This is why neither Bilbo, nor the dwarves, nor even Gandalf heard them coming, nor did they see them. But they were seen by the goblins that ran silently up behind, for Gandalf was letting his wand give out a faint life to help the dwarves as they went along. Quite suddenly, Dory, now at the back again carrying Bilbo, was grabbed from behind in the dark. He shouted and fell, and the hobbit rolled off his shoulders into the blackness and bumped his head on a hard rock, and remembered nothing more. Riddles in the dark. When Bilbo opened his eyes, he wondered if he had, for it was just as dark as with them shut. No one was anywhere near him. Just imagine his fright. He could hear nothing, see nothing, and he could feel nothing except the stone of the floor. Very slowly he got up and groped about on all fours, till he touched the wall of the tunnel, but neither up nor down it could he find anything, nothing at all. No sign of goblins, no sign of dwarves. His head was swimming, and he was far from certain even of the direction they had been going when he had had his fall. He guessed as well as he could, and he crawled along for a good way till suddenly his hand met what felt like a teeny ring of cold metal lying on the floor of the tunnel. It was a turning point in his career, but he did not know it. He put the ring in his pocket almost without thinking. It certainly did not seem of any particular use at that moment. He did not go much further, but sat down on the cold floor and gave himself up to complete miserableness for a long while. He thought of himself frying bacon and eggs in his own kitchen at home, and he could feel inside that it was high time for some meal or other, but that only made him miserabler. He could not think of what to do, nor could he think what had happened, or why he had been left behind, or why, if he had been left behind, the goblins had not caught him, or even why his head was so sore. The truth was, he had been lying quiet, out of sight and out of mind, in a very dark corner for a long while. After some time he felt for his pipe. It was not broken, and that was something. Then he felt for his pouch, and there was some tobacco in it, and that was something more. Then he felt for his matches, and he could not find any at all, and that shattered his hopes completely. Just as well for him, as he agreed when he came to his senses. Goodness knows what the striking of a match and the smell of tobacco would have brought on him out of dark holes in that horrible place. Still, at that moment, he felt very crushed. But in slapping all of his pockets and feeling all around himself for matches, his hand came upon the hilt of his little sword, the little dagger that he had got from the trolls, and that he had quite forgotten. Nor fortunately had the goblins noticed it, as he wore it inside of his breeches. Now he drew it out. It shone pale and dim before his eyes. So it is an elvish blade too, he thought, and goblins are not very near, yet not far enough. But somehow he was comforted. It was rather splendid to be wearing a blade made in Gondolin for the Goblin Wars, of which so many songs had sung. And also, he had noticed that such weapons made a great impression on goblins that came up on them suddenly. Go back, he thought, no good at all. Go sideways, impossible. Go forward, only thing to do. On we go. So he got up and trotted along with his little sword held in front of him, one hand feeling the wall, and his heart all of a pitter-patter. Now certainly Bilbo was in what was called a tight place, but you must remember it was not quite so tight for him as it would have been for me or for you. Hobbits are not quite like ordinary people, and after all, if their holes are nice cheery places and properly aired, quite different from the tunnels of goblins, still they are more used to tunneling than we are, and they do not easily lose their sense of direction underground, not when their heads have recovered from being bumped, and they can move very quietly and hide easily and recover wonderfully from falls and bruises, and they have a fund of wisdom and wise sayings that men have mostly never heard or have forgotten long ago. I should not have liked to have been in Mr. Baggins' place all the same. The tunnel seemed to have no end. All he knew was that it was still going down pretty steadily and keeping in the same direction in spite of a twist and turn or two. There were passages leading off into the side every now and again, as he knew by the glimmer of his sword, or could feel with his hand on the wall. Of these he took no notice, except to hurry past for fear of goblins or half-imagined dark things coming out of them. and on he went, down and down, and still he heard no sound of anything except the occasional whir of a bat by his ears, which startled him at first, till it became too frequent to bother about. I do not know how long he kept on like this, hating to go on, not daring to stop, on and on, until he was tireder than tired. It seemed like all the way to tomorrow, and over it to the days beyond. And so that is H12. Soon, H13.